The morning Ruby Keene's roof caved in was the same morning she decided she would rather sleep beneath open sky than accept a single coin from anyone in the town of Dustcreek, Texas. It was the spring of 1878, and the wind had been mean all week, howling down from the north in great sweeping gusts that rattled windows and sent loose shingles spinning off into the dirt roads like playing cards tossed from a saloon table. Ruby had been lying in her narrow bed listening to the groaning above her, the way the old timber beams shifted and complained, and she had told herself it was fine, that the house had survived worse, that her father had built it solid and strong and it would hold. Then, at precisely the hour before dawn, the eastern corner gave a tremendous crack and 3 feet of rotted roof collapsed inward, dumping a shower of old wood, dust, and accumulated bird nests directly onto the foot of her bed. She sat upright in the darkness with plaster in her hair and splinters across her quilt, and she looked at the jagged hole where the ceiling used to be, and she watched the stars through it, and she said, out loud to no one at all, "Well, that is that." Ruby Keene was 24 years old. She had red-brown hair that she kept pinned tight at the back of her neck during daylight hours because loose hair was impractical, and she had green eyes the color of creek water after a summer rain, and she had a set of strong, capable hands that were already roughened from the work she did at the laundry. She operated out of the back half of her property. She was not beautiful in the way that the dime novels described beautiful women, all soft curves and trembling lips, but she had a quality about her that made men look twice and women respect her, which was something far more useful than conventional beauty in a place like Dustcreek. Her father, Thomas Keene, had died 2 years ago from a fever that had swept through the county in the summer of 1876 and had not much discriminated between the strong and the frail. He had left Ruby the house, the laundry equipment, and a debt to the First Bank of Dustcreek that amounted to $140, which in 1878 was enough to make a person wake in the night with a cold sweat pressing on their chest. She had been paying it down steadily, $5 here, $3 there, stretching every coin until it screamed, and she had been on the verge, genuinely on the verge, of getting ahead when the roof had decided to announce its surrender. She climbed out of bed in the dark and put on her boots and her work dress and stood in the yard looking up at her house, assessing the damage with the same practical eye she turned on everything. The eastern corner was gone for good. The rest of the roof was compromised. It would need full replacement, and full replacement would cost money she did not have, and borrowing money she did not have was something she was no longer willing to do, having learned that particular lesson from watching her father drown in interest payments for the last decade of his life. The town of Dustcreek was a cattle town, situated along the western trail that the drovers used pushing their herds north toward the Kansas railheads. It had a main street with a general store run by the Henderson family, a livery stable, a barbershop that doubled as a dentist office on alternate Tuesdays, a saloon called the Red Dust that did solid business 6 days a week and only slightly less solid business on Sundays, a small church with a patient minister named Reverend Cole, and a sheriff's office occupied by a man named Cal Prout who was reasonably honest as sheriffs went, which meant he was honest about 60% of the time and looked the other way the remaining 40. There was also, since about 6 weeks ago, a new enterprise on the far end of Main Street, occupying the old feed warehouse that had sat empty since the Garvey family moved on to New Mexico. A man named Eli Graves had ridden into Dustcreek on a gray horse with 2 saddlebags, and an expression of controlled quiet that made people step out of his way without quite knowing why. And within a week, he had purchased the warehouse from Old Man Garvey's son who had come out to settle the estate. And within 3 weeks he had carpenters in there hammering and sawing, and within 6 weeks he had opened what he called the Dustcreek Trading Post and Outfitters, which sold provisions, tools, rope, saddle equipment, boots, maps, and a carefully selected range of dry goods that filled a gap the Henderson General Store had never quite managed to cover. The town had not entirely made up its mind about Eli Graves. He was 32 years old, which in a cattle town meant he was old enough to be taken seriously and young enough to still be watched with some suspicion. He was tall, with the kind of lean muscular build that came from actual work rather than inherited advantage, and he had dark hair that he kept short and a jaw that looked like it had been put together with particular intention, and dark brown eyes that were steady and observant in a way that made a person feel simultaneously seen and respected, which was an unusual combination. He spoke quietly and directly, without the verbal decorations that some men used to soften their meaning, and he had a way of listening that suggested he actually intended to remember what you said, which was rarer than it should have been. He had come from Kansas, people said, though exactly where in Kansas and exactly why he had left were subjects he did not volunteer. He had money enough to buy the warehouse and stock it well, but he did not wear his money loudly, which earned him some goodwill among the people who were accustomed to watching wealthy men come through and treat the town like a convenient stop rather than a community. Ruby had seen him twice before the morning her roof fell in. The first time was across the street when she was carrying a basket of clean linens to the Henderson family, and she had noticed him the way you notice a new element in a familiar landscape, with interest but without urgency. The second time was at Reverend Cole's Sunday service, where she had sat 3 rows ahead of him and been aware of his presence the way you are aware of a fire when your back is turned to it, a warmth in a direction you are not looking. She had not spoken to him. She had been too busy surviving to make new acquaintances. On the morning of the collapsed roof, having stood in her yard long enough to understand the full scope of her situation, Ruby walked to the Henderson store when it opened and bought 6 yards of canvas with the last $4 in her household jar. She spent the rest of the morning nailing the canvas over the hole from the inside, standing on a chair and then on the table when the chair was not tall enough. And when she finished, she stood back and looked at it and acknowledged that it would hold out rain for perhaps 2 weeks if the weather was kind, and perhaps 2 days if it was not. Then she tied on her apron and opened her laundry for the day, because the work did not stop because the roof had. She had 4 customers that morning, ranch hands from the Caldwell spread who came in with saddlebags full of filthy clothes every 2 weeks like a tide you could set your calendar by. She took the clothes, gave receipts, noted the pickup date, and when they were gone she stood at her washtub with her arms in hot soapy water up to the elbow, and she thought about the roof, and she thought about the money, and she thought about what she was going to do, and she arrived at no satisfying conclusion. It was in this state of unsatisfying conclusion that Eli Graves appeared at her doorway. He knocked on the open door frame, which she appreciated because some men simply walked in as though the open door was a general invitation to the entire world, and he took off his hat when she turned to look at him, which she also appreciated, and he said, "Miss Keene, my name is Eli Graves. I own the trading post on the far end of Maine." "I know who you are," she said. She did not move from the washtub. "What can I do for you?" "I have a proposition," he said. "I handle laundry," she said. "If it is about laundry, come in. If it is about something else, say so from the door." Something shifted slightly in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the precursor to one. "It is about something else," he said from the door. She dried her hands on her apron and waited. He said, "I noticed your roof this morning. I walked this way to get to the lumber yard and I saw the canvas through the east window frame." "It is a temporary solution," she said. "Yes," he said, "for about 2 weeks if the weather holds." She looked at him steadily. And he said, choosing his words with visible care, "I have a proposal that I believe would benefit both of us, and I want to present it to you properly so that you can consider it on its merits." "Then present it," she said. He came a half step through the door, still holding his hat. He said, "I need laundry services for my establishment, my workers, my inventory cloths, my personal effects. I have been sending things to Abilene with the supply wagon, which is expensive and slow. I would like a contract with a local operation. Yours is the only professional laundry in Dustcreek." Ruby waited, because she could tell that was not all of it. He continued, "The contract would pay you $40 per month, which is significantly above what I know a town this size typically generates in laundry revenue for a single operator. In addition, I would like to propose that in exchange for the difference between a standard contract rate and what I am offering, you allow me to front the cost of repairing your roof. You would pay me back over 12 months at no interest, deducted from the contract payments." Ruby was quiet for a long moment. The soapy water dripped from the edge of the wash tub. Outside, a mockingbird was practicing its imitations in the cottonwood tree. She said, "That is charity dressed in a coat." "It is not charity," he said, and his voice was calm and entirely certain. "It is an investment. Your operation is the only professional laundry service within 30 miles. Dustcreek is growing. The cattle trails are bringing more people through, and more permanent settlers are coming up behind them. A reliable laundry service with a sound building is worth money to me as a business neighbor and as a person who intends to stay in this town. I am not offering you a gift. I am offering you a business arrangement because I believe you are worth the risk." Ruby felt something shift in her chest, not the soft, yielding feeling she might have distrusted, but something harder and more precise, the feeling of a thing being said exactly right. She said, "I have not asked for anyone's assessment of my worth." "No," he said, "you have not, which is part of what makes you worth the assessment." They looked at each other across the laundry room. The morning light was coming through the south window, and it was the clean, honest light of a Texas spring that showed everything clearly and hid nothing. She said, "I would need to see the terms written down." "I will have them written down this afternoon," he said. "I would need a lawyer to look at them, or at minimum Reverend Cole, who I trust." "Bring whoever you choose," he said. She looked at him another moment, reading the steadiness in his face, the absence of hidden amusement or condescension, the straightforward quality of his attention. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said, "with the written terms." He nodded once, put his hat back on and said, "Thank you, Miss Keene," and left. She stood in the laundry room for a full minute after his footsteps faded, her hands still wrapped in her apron, her heart beating with a kind of purposeful energy she had not felt in quite a while. He came back the next morning with 2 pages of carefully written terms in a clear and legible hand. She read them at her kitchen table while he sat across from her with his hat on his knee and his coffee untouched, because she had offered it automatically, and he had accepted it politely, and then left it alone while she read. The terms were precisely what he had described, no surprises hidden in the margins, no clauses that bent back on themselves to favor him. The contract rate was $40 per month. The roof cost was listed at $65, which was an honest estimate she later confirmed at the lumber yard. The repayment was spread over 12 months deducted from the contract, and there was no interest as promised, and there was no clause granting him any authority over her operation or her property. She read it twice. Then she read the second page again. She said, "This is a fair contract." "I intended it to be," he said. She said, "You wrote this yourself." "I did." "You have some experience with contracts." "I do," he said, without elaborating, and she noted the restraint and filed it away for later consideration. She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her with that steady, undemanding attention, the kind that did not press or lean. She said, "I want to be clear about something, Mr. Graves. I will sign this contract because it is a fair business arrangement and because my roof needs to be repaired before it kills someone. I will honor every term of it, and I will repay the advance on exactly the schedule written here. I am not entering into any other kind of arrangement." "I understand that completely," he said, and he said it in a way that suggested he genuinely did, without any edge of disappointment or negotiating smile. She picked up the pen she had set on the table, and she signed her name at the bottom of the second page in her strong, clear handwriting, Ruby Keene, and she slid it across to him, and he signed his name beside hers, Eli Graves, with the same economical care he seemed to bring to everything. He took his copy and folded it into his breast pocket and picked up his coffee cup and drank from it. And for the first time since he had walked into her laundry the previous morning, he seemed to settle into a kind of ease, as though the formalities being concluded had released him from a particular posture. He said, "The carpenters I used for the trading post are good men. I can send them over Thursday." "Thursday is fine," she said. And then, because the moment seemed to call for something more and she was not entirely without social grace, she said, "The coffee is getting cold." "It is still good," he said, and drank the rest of it. The carpenters came Thursday and spent 3 days replacing the eastern section of the roof and reinforcing the beams along the whole ridge while they were at it. Because, when they opened up the damaged section, they found that the rot had spread farther than was visible from outside, which meant the job cost $80 instead of $65, and Ruby said, standing in her yard watching them work, that she would not pay more than the contracted amount because that was what had been agreed. Eli came by on the second day to check the work and heard the adjustment from the head carpenter, a solid man named Jonas Brower, and he said to Ruby, "The additional work is necessary for the structural integrity of the building. The contract number stands. The difference is my responsibility as the party who estimated incorrectly." She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "That is a lot of money to absorb on an estimation error." "Yes," he said. "Most men would find a way to pass it along." "I am not most men," he said, which was said simply and without performance, and because it was simple and without performance she found herself believing it entirely. She said nothing more about the money. She paid Brower the $65 on the final day as agreed, and the roof was solid and sound, with new cedar shingles that smelled extraordinary in the morning when the dew came down, and the sun hit them and drew out the oil in the wood. The first month of the contract was notable mainly for the establishing of its rhythms. Eli sent his laundry over every Monday morning, bundled and labeled in the organized way that she came to recognize as characteristic of him, and she had it done and ready every Friday afternoon. He came to collect it himself rather than sending a hired hand, which she noticed. They spoke briefly at those collections, in the practical mode of business partners attending to business. He was in and out in 10 minutes, paid promptly, and the transactions were clean and uncomplicated. But the town of Dustcreek was not a large town, and their paths crossed outside of those Friday transactions. They were both at the Henderson store one Wednesday in early May when a supply wagon came in from Abilene, and the whole town came out to see what news it brought and what goods had arrived, because a supply wagon was still an event in 1878, and people were not too proud to admit it. Ruby was choosing thread and a new thimble when Eli came in behind her to collect a package of merchandise he had ordered, and they stood near each other in the press of people and talked about ordinary things, the quality of the spring weather, whether the cattle trails would bring more settlers this year than last, whether Reverend Cole's new hymnals had arrived in the shipment. It was conversation as ordinary as breathing, and yet Ruby noticed, walking home afterward, that she had been entirely comfortable the whole time, comfortable in the specific way that you are only comfortable with people whose company is genuinely good. She thought about this more than she intended to. She had been careful since her father died. There had been a man named Chester Albright who had shown interest in her about a year after the death, a moderately prosperous rancher with good land and a decent reputation, and he had been kind enough, and she had allowed herself to consider it. And then she had realized, over several conversations, that what Chester Albright wanted was a capable woman to run his house and manage his domestic accounts, and that his attraction to her was in fact an attraction to her efficiency. And that being admired for your efficiency by a man who found your actual person somewhat inconvenient was not a basis for anything she wanted. She had ended it before it properly began, kindly but clearly, and Chester had recovered his dignity within a month and had proposed to a girl named Alice Fenner the following spring, who by all accounts was very happy and suited to him perfectly, which Ruby considered a fine outcome for everyone. Since Chester, she had not allowed herself to think about any man in particular, which was easy because she had been genuinely too busy surviving to have much energy left over for the complicated business of other people's hearts. It was harder to maintain that policy when Eli Graves was at the Henderson store talking about the weather and the hymnals, and making her laugh with a dry observation about the Henderson boy's new hat, which was approximately 3 sizes too large and sat around the boy's ears like a bucket. He did not push. That was the thing she noticed most consistently. He never leaned forward in the way that men leaned when they were calculating something. He was simply present, pleasantly and without agenda, or at least without visible agenda, and Ruby was a perceptive enough woman to understand the difference between no agenda and concealed agenda, and she was relatively certain it was the former. In the second month of the contract, 2 things happened that changed the texture of their acquaintance. The first was that a drover came through Dustcreek with a herd of 1,200 longhorns on their way to the Kansas railheads, and one of the cowboys in the drover's employ, a young man named Pete Sully, who was no more than 20 years old and had been in the saddle for 6 weeks straight, came into Ruby's laundry in a state of combined exhaustion and frontier cheerfulness, bringing a pile of clothes and also a quantity of muddy trail water that he dripped across the floor. And while Ruby was writing up his ticket, he made what he clearly intended as a charming remark about her red-brown hair, which came out more forward than charming, and when she looked at him with the green eyes that had been saying no to forward men since before he had likely started shaving, he wilted appropriately and apologized with genuine embarrassment and left without further incident. But Eli had been across the street at the time and had seen the episode through her open door from the outside, and when he came to collect his laundry that Friday he said, without making a large thing of it, "That drover's boy behaved himself on Wednesday." She looked at him. "He did, after a brief education." "Good," he said. "I am capable of administering my own education," she said, with a specific emphasis that was not quite a challenge and not quite a reassurance. "I know you are," he said easily. "I was just curious." She considered him. "You were watching from across the street." "I was sweeping my front steps," he said, which was entirely plausible. And if the education had gone differently, he thought about this honestly, which she appreciated. He said, "I suppose I would have come across the street." "And I would have told you to go back to your steps," she said. "And I would have gone back to my steps," he said. They looked at each other for a moment, and she felt the corner of her mouth pull up in spite of itself, and she turned away to get his bundled laundry before the smile became a conversation. The second thing that happened in the second month was that Ruby's contract payments brought her laundry income to a level that finally exceeded her operating costs and her bank debt payment by a significant enough margin that she could begin to contemplate things she had not contemplated in 2 years. Things like a new copper wash stub to replace the one that had developed a slow seam leak. Things like having meat 3 times a week instead of 2. Things like sitting on her repaired roof in the evenings watching the Texas sunset and feeling something that was not exactly happiness but was adjacent to it. Some wider and more spacious feeling, the feeling of a woman who has been fighting uphill for a long time and has finally reached level ground. She walked to the trading post one Thursday morning to purchase a coil of rope and some salt blocks she needed, and she found Eli behind the counter entering figures in a ledger with the focused expression of a man who was good at numbers and knew it. He looked up when she came in, and the focused expression gave way to the quieter expression he wore for her, which she had now catalogued well enough to recognize as distinct from any other face he showed. She said her purchases and he got them from the shelves himself rather than calling for his hired man. And while he was wrapping the salt blocks in paper, he said, conversationally, without looking up from the wrapping, "The Hendersons are having a social next Saturday evening. The whole town is invited." "I know," she said. "Will you go?" he said, still looking at the wrapping. "I expect so," she said. "Mrs. Henderson has been a steady customer and it would be impolite to decline." "That is my reasoning as well," he said. He tied the paper with a length of twine and looked at her. "I wonder if you would allow me to escort you." The word allow was an interesting choice, she thought. Not ask you to accompany me, which would position him as the initiator and her as the acquiescer. Allow me, which positioned the decision entirely with her. She said, "That would be acceptable." His expression did not dramatically change, but something in the set of his shoulders eased fractionally, and she noticed that too and filed it carefully away. The Henderson social was held in the wide yard behind the store, which the Henderson family had strung with paper lanterns that were frankly extravagant for Dustcreek and must have cost something. And there were long tables with food, and a musician from the Red Dust Saloon playing fiddle and looking considerably more respectable than he usually did. And most of the town was there, including Reverend Cole and his wife and Sheriff Prout, who was drinking the lemonade with an expression, suggesting he wished it were something else. Eli came to her door at 7 o'clock in a dark coat that was clean and well-pressed and boots that had been polished, not extravagantly but with care, and he offered his arm with a formality that was genuine rather than performed, and she took it with the same quality of genuineness, and they walked the 3 blocks to the Henderson place under a sky that was turning that deep violet that Texas evenings sometimes produced in the spring. The kind of color that seemed too theatrical to be natural and was entirely natural. They talked through most of the evening. That was the sum of it in some ways, and in others it was a great deal more than that. They sat at one of the long tables and ate and they talked, first about the town and then about the cattle trade, and then about the railroad expanding westward and what it was likely to do to the trail droving business, and then about Kansas where he had come from, and she felt him decide something internally before he began talking about Kansas. The way a person takes a breath before stepping into cold water. He had come from Dodge City, which was the roughest of the rough trail towns, and he had been there for 4 years running a supply operation that had done well. And then it had done less well, not through failure, but through a violence that the trail towns produced reliably. His partner had been killed in a dispute that had nothing to do with their business and everything to do with the way Dodge City was organized in those years, with money and guns and very little in between. And after that, Eli had found himself unwilling to build something in a place where it could be unmade so casually. He had sold his share of the operation to the remaining partner and spent 6 months traveling Texas before stopping in Dustcreek, which was rough in the ordinary way of cattle towns but not in the particular brutal way of Dodge. Ruby listened to all of this. She said when he was done, "I am sorry about your partner." "His name was Martin Caldwell," Eli said. "Good man. Better with horses than anyone I ever met." "Was he family to you?" He thought about this. "The kind you make yourself," he said, "not the kind you are born to." She understood that exactly. She said so. He looked at her and said, "Your father, 2 years ago," she said, "fever." "I heard," he said quietly. "I am sorry." "He was a good man," she said, "not a practical one. He loved this land more than he understood it, which is a quality I found sometimes exasperating and ultimately very moving." "You loved him," Eli said. "Entirely," she said. The fiddle player was playing something slow now, a waltz that was slightly irregular in tempo as though he were negotiating with the melody, and several couples were dancing in the cleared space near the barn. Eli looked at the dancers and then at Ruby with a question in his expression that he did not need to voice. She said, "I am a passable dancer." "I am a mediocre one," he said. "We will likely cancel each other out to a reasonable average." She laughed at that. A genuine laugh that surprised her with its openness, and he was smiling, a real smile that was different from the controlled expressions she had catalogued previously, warmer and less guarded, and it changed his face considerably. They danced. He was not actually mediocre. He was better than mediocre, steady and sure-footed in the way he was about most things. And she was better than passable, having learned to dance from her mother who had believed in dancing as a form of spiritual maintenance. And together they were, she thought, reasonably good, which was more than the modest entries on both sides had promised. She was aware of the way his hand sat at her waist, not heavy or presumptuous, just present, the way he was present in everything he did, as a solid and accountable fact. They danced twice and then stood at the edge of the gathering, and he brought her a glass of lemonade, and they watched the other couples and talked more, and the evening turned on around them like a wheel, and they were still in conversation when the paper lanterns were extinguished, and Mrs. Henderson began covering the food tables with cloth. He walked her home under a sky now full of stars. The Milky Way spread across it in its particular extravagance, and they stopped at her gate, and he said, "I had a very good evening, Miss Keene." "So did I," she said, and she meant it with the full weight of the simple words. He said, "Would you be willing to walk with me sometime? There is a stretch of the creek north of town that I have been meaning to explore since the weather improved." She said, "Next Sunday afternoon, after the service." He nodded once, that same economical nod, and said good evening and walked away down the dark street, and Ruby stood at her gate and watched him go, and then stood a moment longer than that, looking at the stars, feeling the warm Texas night on her skin and the complicated happy weight of something beginning. They walked by the creek the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. They established a rhythm of these walks, quiet and unhurried, along the north stretch where the cottonwoods grew thick, and the water ran clear over polished limestone, and the walks were the kind of conversation that could only happen when you were moving, when you were both looking at the same landscape rather than at each other. The kind of honesty that came in sideways because the direct confrontation of facing someone made people guard their words. She told him about her mother, who had died when Ruby was 12, and what it had been like to grow up after that in a house with her father where tenderness was present but never spoken, where love was expressed through cooked meals and mended things, and the particular way he always left her portion of everything slightly larger than his own. She told him about learning the laundry trade from Mrs. Delvecchio, the woman who had run it before her father bought the building, an Italian widow who was stern and practical, and had told Ruby, on the day she finally acknowledged Ruby had mastered every element of the work, that a woman who was good at her work was the freest kind of person in the world. Ruby had never forgotten that. Eli told her about growing up in Missouri before the war had shattered everything there, and about coming west as a young man of 19, when Missouri no longer felt like a place that wanted to contain him. He had worked cattle drives for 2 years, which explained the ease in his body around horses and wide open spaces, and then he had found his way into trade and commerce, which suited his particular mind better than droving, because he liked the puzzle of things. The way supply and demand were a kind of language that you could learn to read if you paid attention. He said, one Sunday walking along the creek with the afternoon light making green fire of the cottonwood leaves overhead, "You read very carefully." She said, "What do you mean?" "People," he said. "You read people the way I read ledgers, looking for the actual number, not the presented one." She considered this. "Is that a compliment?" "It is an observation," he said. "One I mean very respectfully." "Then yes," she said, "I do. You read me on the first morning," he said, "before I had said very much. You decided whether I was worth listening to in about 30 seconds. 15, she said. He looked at her sidelong and she kept her face composed, and then she could not, and she smiled and he smiled back, and they walked on under the green light. The 3rd month of the contract brought the summer heat, which in Texas in June of 1878 was the kind of heat that made everything shimmer at the edges and turned the dust roads into something that seemed to breathe. It also brought a development that Ruby had not anticipated and which required careful consideration. Mrs. Delvecchio, who had retired to a small house on the south edge of Dustcreek, and who Ruby visited regularly out of affection and out of the ongoing education that the old woman's experience represented, called Ruby in one June afternoon and said, "I heard about the contract with the Graves man." "It is a fair contract," Ruby said. "I do not doubt it," Mrs. Delvecchio said. She was 70 years old and had been in Texas since 1841 and had opinions about everything and was right about most of them. "I also heard you walked out with him 3 Sundays running." "Along the creek," Ruby said. "Along the creek," Mrs. Delvecchio repeated in a tone that assigned a great deal of meaning to a preposition. Ruby said, "He is a good man." "I expect he is," Mrs. Delvecchio said. "Are you going to let yourself know that, or are you going to keep it at a business arrangement until one of you gets old?" Ruby was quiet for a moment. "I am being careful," she said. "There is careful," Mrs. Delvecchio said, "and there is careful that is actually fear wearing careful as a disguise." Ruby looked at her. The old woman looked back with the unimpressed gaze of someone who had worn out 3 pairs of eyes on the human condition. Ruby went home and thought about that for a week. On the 4th Sunday walk, at the turn in the creek where the limestone shelf came out over the water and made a natural seat that they had taken to stopping at, Eli said, with the preparatory quality she now recognized as him deciding to step into cold water, "Ruby." It was the first time he had used her name without the formal address, and the use of it was itself a kind of declaration. She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to tell you something plainly and I want you to take it as what it is, which is simply the truth and not as a pressure on anything." "All right," she said. He said, "I care about you, not as a business partner, though you are a fine one. I care about you as a person, and I have been finding that it grows the more I know you, and I wanted you to know that I know that and that I am not going to pretend otherwise." She was quiet for a moment with the creek running below the limestone shelf and the cottonwoods stirring in the small afternoon wind. She said, "I care about you too. I have been being careful about it." "I know," he said. "I was afraid," she said, and the honesty of it surprised her even as she said it. "Not of you specifically. Of the arrangement of it, of needing someone, of being in a position where another person could matter so much that losing them would be another kind of unmanageable." He was quiet, listening. She said, "My father's death left me in a state of considerable difficulty, not only the financial difficulty, the other kind, and I rebuilt from that, and I was proud of the rebuilding, and I did not want to build anything that could fall again." He said, "That is a reasonable fear. Mrs. Delvecchio says it is fear wearing careful as a disguise." "Mrs. Delvecchio is very wise," he said. "Yes," Ruby said. The creek ran and the leaves stirred, and she looked at the water for a long, quiet moment, and then she looked at him. He was looking at the water too, not pressuring her with his attention, just present, as he always was, as a solid and accountable fact. She said, "I do not know what I want exactly." "I am not asking you to know," he said. "I am only asking you to know that I care about you. The rest can take its time." She felt something open in her chest, not the frightening vulnerable opening she had been guarding against, but something more like a window being unlatched, a current of air into a room that has been closed too long. She said, "I would like to continue walking with you." "I would like that very much," he said. They sat on the limestone shelf for another hour and watched the water and talked about other things, easier things, and when they walked back to town the distance between them was a fraction of what it had been going out, and she was aware of his shoulder near hers on the path, the warmth of that proximity, and she did not step away from it. The summer unrolled. The heat intensified as Texas summers do, reaching a pitch that made even the mockingbird sound irritable, and Ruby moved her washing operation to the earlier hours of the morning to avoid the worst of it, starting before the sun was fully up and finishing the bulk of the work before noon, then spending the hottest part of the day doing the bookkeeping and the mending and the business of running the place in the relative shade of her back room. Eli came by most evenings. He would knock on her door around the time the heat was finally beginning to ease, and she would come out onto her porch, and he would either sit in the other chair or stand at the porch rail. And they would talk while the evening sky did its extravagant Texas things, turning colors that seemed implausible, pinks and oranges and golds, that the eastern states likely never produced in quite that profligacy. They talked about everything. She found him to be one of the most genuinely curious people she had ever encountered. Curious in the way that meant he actually wanted to understand things, rather than simply wanting to appear knowledgeable. And he was interested in her thinking in a way that was different from the way men were usually interested in women's thinking, which often had the quality of a man being politely surprised that a woman was thinking at all. Eli was interested the way you are interested in a mind that is good and does things you do not expect and illuminates things differently than your own. He told her one evening in July that he had been writing to a supplier in San Antonio about expanding the trading post's inventory to include better quality farming implements, because his observation of the town's trajectory suggested that more settlers with farming intentions were going to be coming through, and he wanted to be positioned for that. She listened to his analysis and asked 3 questions that had not occurred to him, and he was quiet for a moment after the third one and then said, "I need to rethink 2 parts of the plan." She said, not unkindly, "You were not accounting for the creek flooding in spring. The north end of Main Street goes under 3 feet of water in a heavy rain year." He said, "How do you know that?" "Because I have lived here my whole life," she said, "and my father's property flooded twice before he moved the laundry to the back of the building." He looked at her and said, "You know this town better than anyone." "I grew up in it," she said. "I need to be honest with you," he said. She waited. He said, "I have been considering something for a while and I want your opinion on it, as a businesswoman who knows this town, and as a person whose judgment I respect a great deal." "Go ahead," she said. He said, "The trading post is doing well. Well enough that I am thinking about whether it should grow, and in what direction, and whether there is a structure here that makes sense for a real long-term establishment. And I have been thinking that the person I would most want to think through that structure with is you." She looked at him. The evening light was making everything golden, and the cicadas had started up in the cottonwood, and the sound of them was the sound of deep summer, the sound that more than any other made her think of her father and of childhood, and of this particular piece of land that she had never been able to leave, even when leaving might have been the sensible, practical answer. She said, "Is that a business question or a different kind of question?" He was quiet for a moment, choosing. He said, "Both," she said. "Then ask both." He turned in his chair to face her and said, "I am in love with you, Ruby. I have been since about the 3rd Sunday at the creek, though there are arguments to be made for earlier. And I am asking whether you might consider building something here with me, not as a charitable rescue and not as a business arrangement, but as 2 people who respect each other and want the same kinds of things from their lives." She looked at the sky, which was full of color, and she thought about Mrs. Delvecchio's words about fear wearing careful as a disguise, and she thought about her father who had loved this land more than he understood it, and she thought about the way the morning light came through her repaired roof and the smell of new cedar, and the way she had stood in her yard the morning after the roof fell in and said, "Well, that is that," and had meant it as an ending but which had turned out to be a beginning. She said, "I am in love with you too. I have been managing it carefully for several months, which you probably know." "I suspected," he said, and his voice was careful and warm. She said, "I will not be managed or directed in my business." "I know that," he said. "My laundry is mine. Whatever we build together, that remains mine." "I would not have it any other way," he said, and she believed him entirely. She said, "Then ask me properly, Eli." He stood up from his chair, and he was tall in the evening light with the gold of it on his face and his dark eyes steady and open in a way she had not seen them open quite this completely before, the last guard down, the whole of him present. He said, "Ruby Keene, will you marry me?" She said, "Yes." They were married in September of 1878 by Reverend Cole in the small church on Main Street, which was full to its modest capacity because the whole town turned out, and Mrs. Delvecchio sat in the front row and wept with an open satisfaction that she made no effort to conceal, and the Henderson family brought a cake that was arguably the best thing ever baked in Dustcreek, and Sheriff Prout was present and honest about 100% of the time for the occasion, which was a wedding gift in its own right. Ruby wore a dress she had made herself from fabric ordered from San Antonio, a deep green that made her eyes look like the creek in summertime, and she wore her hair down, which she almost never did, and the effect of it combined with the dress and the morning light in the church was enough that Eli, who was not a man given to public emotional display, had to look at his boots for a full 3 seconds to maintain his composure when she walked down the aisle. A fact that she noticed and that she cherished quietly for years afterward. The ceremony was simple and honest, which suited them both, and when Reverend Cole asked if anyone present had cause to object to the union, there was a brief silence during which Ruby heard someone in the back shift their boots on the floorboards, and she recognized the sound as Chester Albright, who had indeed showed up, and who stayed quiet through the whole ceremony and shook Eli's hand afterward and told Ruby she looked very well, which was gracious of him, and which she appreciated. They walked out of the church into the September sunshine as husband and wife, and the whole of Dustcreek cheered in the way of a small town that is genuinely pleased. And Ruby looked up at the sky, and at her town around her, and at the man standing beside her, who was holding her hand with the same solid, accountable presence he had always had, and she felt something so complete and so warm that it seemed almost too large for one person to contain. Their life together in those first months was the revelation that she had suspected it might be, and that had frightened her accordingly. They lived in her house initially, because it was larger than his rooms above the trading post, and because she had the laundry there, and because she had simply more of a life established, and he moved in with the same efficient lack of fuss that characterized everything he did, bringing 2 trunks and a crate of books and a particular chair that he had owned since Missouri and that he set by the window in what had been her father's sitting room. She liked the books. She had grown up in a house with few of them and had always felt the lack, and having shelves of them was a kind of luxury that she had not anticipated as a feature of marriage, and which pleased her enormously. He read to her sometimes in the evenings. She was not a person who had been read to, and the first time he did it, without ceremony, simply picking up a book, and saying, "If you have a moment I want to read you something," she had felt a tenderness so acute it was almost painful. They also worked well together, which was perhaps less romantic to report, but which was in practice one of the most important qualities of a shared life. When the fall brought a rush of business to the trading post, with the last cattle drives of the season coming through and the settlers heading to their winter camps, and Ruby's laundry was similarly slammed with the increased traffic, they moved through the busy weeks with a coordination that felt effortless, because it was based on genuine mutual understanding and respect. He never told her how to run her laundry. She never told him how to run his store. But they talked about everything, in the evenings and at the kitchen table in the mornings, and in the space between sentences that people who live together well develop, a kind of ongoing conversation that never fully closes. One October evening, Eli said to her at the table with his ledger open and his coffee at his elbow, "I want to talk to you about something." "Good or worrying?" she asked, without looking up from the mending. "Good, I think," he said. "Mrs. Delvecchio's house." She looked up then. He said, "She is going to her nephew in San Antonio in the spring. She mentioned it to me this week. The house will be for sale." "I know," Ruby said. "She told me last month." "Her house is adjacent to your laundry property," he said. "It shares the back fence line," she said. He said, "If we bought it, you could expand the laundry operation. A second wash room. Hire a girl to help with the work. Trading Post is growing, the town is growing, and the laundry needs to grow with it, or you will be at capacity with no room to take on new business." She put the mending down and looked at him steadily. He said, "The money would come from the trading post profits. It would be your laundry that benefits, not mine. I would ask for nothing in return, and I would sign nothing that gave me any claim on the property." She said, "Eli," he said, "it is not charity, it is." "I know," she said, and she was smiling. "You were going to say it is an investment and I am worth the risk." He looked at her and the corner of his mouth pulled up. "Something like that," he said. She said, "I know it is not charity. You have never offered me charity in your life." "Then you will consider it," she said. "I will do more than consider it, but we will split the cost of the purchase. Half from the trading post and half from my laundry savings, because I have them now, Eli. I have them because of this year and the contract and what we have built here, and I want to use them for this because this is mine too, and I want that reflected in how we do it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him understanding exactly what she meant and being glad of it. He said, "Half and half." "Half and half," she agreed. She went to see Mrs. Delvecchio the next morning, and the old woman sold her the house for a price that was fair and not excessive. And she said to Ruby when the papers were signed, in the Italian-accented English that still carried the cadence of the old country even after 40 years in Texas, "You have done well, Ruby. Your mother would be proud." Ruby said, "I had help." Mrs. Delvecchio said, with the look that assigned meaning to things, "The best kind of help." By the spring of 1879, the expanded laundry was operational. Ruby had hired a young woman named Grace Sutter, who was 17 and the daughter of a settler family that had come through the previous fall and stayed when the father had found work at the Caldwell Ranch. Grace was quick and willing and capable of learning, and Ruby taught her with the same rigorous patience that Mrs. Delvecchio had used, because she believed that a woman who was good at her work was the freest kind of person in the world, and she intended to produce another one. The trading post continued to grow. Eli's instinct about the farming settlers proved accurate, and the new farming implements he had sourced from San Antonio sold out within 2 months of their arrival, and he ordered more and added a second category of goods aimed at the homesteading trade rather than the droving trade, which was a significant strategic expansion. He hired 2 men to help run the floor of the store and spent more of his own time on the purchasing and planning side, which suited his particular abilities. Dustcreek in the spring of 1879 was not the same town it had been when Ruby's roof fell in. The Western Trail traffic had brought more permanent settlers in its wake. The Way River traffic always brings settlers eventually, and there were 14 new buildings along Main Street and 2 new streets running off it, and a second church for the Methodist congregation that had been meeting in the schoolhouse, and a proper doctor who had come from Philadelphia, and who found Texas considerably different from what he had been trained for but was adapting with determination. Ruby and Eli were at the center of it, not by seeking any particular prominence, but because they were both good at what they did, and because the town had come to associate them with a certain quality of steady, reliable enterprise. In June of 1879, Ruby told Eli over the kitchen table in the morning, with the new cedar roof above them and the summer sun coming through the east windows and Grace already out back starting the morning wash, that she was expecting a child. He went very still for a moment, the particular still of someone receiving information so important that it requires the whole system to pause. Then he said, "Ruby," and his voice had something in it she had never heard before, the sound of a man whose happiness has exceeded his capacity to contain it quietly. She said, "I thought you should know." He stood up from the table and came around it, and she stood, and he held her with a gentleness and a completeness that was everything she had never known to want and had found anyway, here in Dustcreek, Texas, in the latter half of the 19th century, in a life that had been hard and was now good. He said against her hair, "Are you well?" "I am extremely well," she said. He said, "I want you to slow down." "I am not going to slow down," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to want it on record." She laughed, muffled against his shoulder, and held on. The months of the pregnancy were months of deep contentment that Ruby had not known it was possible for her to feel, a contentment that was not complacency but was instead the feeling of a person who has built something real and knows it and can rest in that knowledge. She continued to run the laundry, with Grace handling the heavier physical work as the months progressed, and Ruby managing the accounts and the customer relations and the supply ordering with the same efficiency, simply redirected. Eli hovered in the way she had known he would, with the restraint to not actually restrict her movements but with a consistent warm presence that made her feel accompanied in the best sense. She told him one November evening, when they were sitting on the porch in the cooler air with the last of the cottonwood leaves coming down in the dark, that she thought she understood now why her father had loved this land more than he understood it. He said, "Tell me." She said, "Because when you love something this much, understanding it almost doesn't matter. You just want to stay inside it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." She said, "Do not make a habit of expecting them." He laughed, genuine and warm, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the leaves fall in the lamplight from the window. Their son was born in December of 1879, in the house with the new cedar roof, delivered by the doctor from Philadelphia who turned out to be considerably better at frontier medicine than anyone had expected. He was a healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and a disposition that announced itself immediately as one of particular confidence. And they named him Thomas, for Ruby's father, and the middle name James, for Eli's partner who had not got to see anything like this. Reverend Cole baptized Thomas James Graves on a Sunday in January of 1880, and Mrs. Delvecchio, who had delayed her departure to San Antonio twice already, and had not yet quite left Dustcreek for reasons that seemed to have everything to do with not wanting to miss important events, was there in the front row again, and she wept again with the same open satisfaction. The years that followed were good years, built on the foundation of that first year's careful, honest work. The laundry expanded again in 1881 when Ruby purchased the remaining land adjacent to the back of the property and built a proper laundry building, with 2 proper washrooms and a drying room for the winter months and an office at the front where she kept her accounts. And she hired 2 more women to work alongside Grace, who had become, exactly as Ruby had intended, completely formidable at her work. Ruby paid her women fairly and paid them on time and treated them with the same respect she expected from everyone, and this was not unremarkable in 1881 in Texas, and it was noted. The trading post became one of the most successful operations in that part of the county. Eli's instinct about Dustcreek's growth had been correct, and the town grew steadily through the early 1880s as the railroad came incrementally closer, bringing with it the predictable transformation of a cattle trail town into a more settled commercial center. He navigated that transformation well, adjusting the store's inventory and focus as the town's needs changed, and his reputation for honest dealing brought him customers from 20 miles around. They built a larger house in 1882, still on the same property, expanded from the original structure her father had built, with 3 proper bedrooms and a wide covered porch that went around 2 sides, and a kitchen that was large enough for the cooking to be done without everyone standing on each other, and a real parlor with the books on the shelves and his chair from Missouri by the window, and a second chair that had been bought for her, and that she used often enough to show its wear. Their second child was a daughter, born in the autumn of 1882, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular expression of composed assessment, and they named her Clara. Thomas, who was 2 years old and had opinions about everything, received his sister with the resigned tolerance of someone who is outnumbered before they have fully understood the situation, and then within 3 weeks had become her most dedicated and occasionally overwhelming champion. Ruby watched her children with the same clear-eyed attentiveness she turned on everything, learning them the way she had learned the town, from the inside and with full investment, and she found them to be the most interesting people she had ever known, which she had not expected, and which she tried to remember every day because she knew from experience how quickly ordinary days could become the past. Eli was a father of the kind she had suspected he would be, consistent and present and genuinely interested in what his children were doing and thinking, which meant they wanted to talk to him and were comfortable being honest with him, which Ruby considered the highest possible achievement in that department. There was an evening in 1883 when Dustcreek had one of its periodic excitements, a matter involving a dispute between two ranching families over water rights that had been festering for years, and that came briefly to a public confrontation in the street that required Sheriff Prout to interpose himself with more courage than he usually required. And there was a tense hour during which it was unclear whether the whole thing would resolve peacefully or not. It resolved peacefully because several men of good standing in the community came out to stand with the sheriff, and Eli was among them, not with any intention of violence but with the simple, reliable presence that he had, the quality of being someone whose being there changed what was possible. He came home that evening and she said to him when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, "You did not have to do that." He said, "I live here. I have business here. I have people here. If I step back from a moment like that, what am I building all this for?" She said, "The water rights dispute is not your dispute." He said, "A town is everyone's dispute or it is no one's, and if it is no one's then it is not a town." She looked at him and felt that precise thing she had felt in the early days, the feeling of a thing being said exactly right, and she said, "That is the most sensible thing you have said all year." He said, "I am generally sensible." "Moderately," she said, and went to pour them both something warm, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked until the lamp was low. In 1884, they went to San Antonio together for a week, the first time Ruby had been off the Dustcreek property since her wedding, leaving the laundry in Grace's capable hands, and leaving Thomas and Clara with a woman named Mrs. Briggs who was solid and trustworthy, and who informed Thomas within the first hour that his mother might think he was charming but she was immune to it, which Ruby considered extremely well handled. San Antonio was large and noisy, and full of the particular energy of a city that existed at the collision of several cultural streams, the Spanish and Mexican past, the German settlement of the hill country, the Anglo commerce pressing west, and the indigenous presence that was everywhere in the landscape if not in the streets, an absence that was itself a presence, the ghost of what had been there before all of it, which Ruby felt with a discomfort that seemed important to feel. The history of this land was complicated and violent, and the prosperity she had built on it was real and earned and also existed in a context that she thought about on that trip more than she had thought about it before. She said this to Eli one evening in San Antonio, walking along the river in the warm city dusk. He said, "I think about it too." She said, "Do you think there is any way to account for it, in how we live or what we do?" He said, "I do not know if account for is the right phrase. I think there is being aware of it and not pretending it does not exist. And I think there is how you treat the people who are here now, which is the part you can actually act on." She said, "That is not a full answer." "No," he said, "it is not. I'm not sure there is a full answer for any of us who arrived after the taking was done and built on what was taken. I think we carry that and we do not pretend it away." She took his hand walking along the river and held it, and they were quiet with the complicated weight of it, which was something, she thought, more honest than pretending the weight was not there. They came home to Dustcreek with their children and their work and the good life they had built, and they carried what they had talked about with them in the way that things worth carrying are carried. Grace Sutter married a carpenter named David Holt in 1885, and Ruby closed the laundry for the whole day to attend the wedding, and gave Grace a set of linens from the best stock she had ordered from San Antonio, and Grace cried and said she did not need all of them, and Ruby said she was taking all of them, and that was the end of it. Thomas started school in 1885, which he approached with the same confidence he had brought to everything since the moment of his arrival, and within a month, the school teacher, a patient young woman named Miss Elbow who had come from Austin, sent a note home saying that Thomas was a bright and enthusiastic student who might benefit from being encouraged to allow other students the opportunity to answer questions sometimes. Ruby read this note with the expression of a woman who is laughing on the inside and maintaining composure on the outside, and she showed it to Eli at dinner, and he had to fold his napkin over his face for a moment. Clara, at 3, was observing everything with those dark, composed eyes, and filing it all away with a thoroughness that suggested she was going to be formidable when she was old enough to act on the information. The laundry business was firmly established by 1885 as the best operation in the county, with contracts from 3 ranches and 2 hotels that had opened as the town grew, and Ruby had a 3rd employee now, and was the only business in town besides the trading post and the bank that had grown every single year since its founding. She had paid off her father's debt in full in 1880, and she had done it without fanfare, simply walking into the first bank of Dustcreek one morning and placing the final payment on the desk of the banker named Hartwell, who had always treated her with the mild condescension that bankers in that era reserved for women conducting business alone, and she had said, "That is the Keene estate debt, settled in full," and had taken the receipt and walked out into the sunshine feeling something she imagined her father would have felt, a final clearing of the air. On their 5th anniversary, in September of 1883, Eli gave her a ring. She had not had a proper wedding ring, having married in some practical haste as far as jewelry was concerned, and he had ordered this one from a jeweler in San Antonio, and it was simple and well-made and exactly right for her hands, and she wore it from that day forward alongside the plain band they had exchanged in the church. She gave him a new set of ledgers with his name embossed on the covers, which was practical and which he received with complete genuine pleasure, because he was a man who found joy in good tools. She also gave him a letter, which she had written out the night before at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, 3 pages in her clear, strong hand, telling him what the 5 years had been. She had never been easy with spoken sentimentality, which he knew, and so the letter was her way of saying the things that were too large for ordinary conversation. Things about how the morning after the roof fell she had been so tired and so tightly wound with the effort of maintaining everything alone, and how he had appeared with his written contract and his steady eyes and his refusal to offer her less than the full truth, and how she had signed her name next to his and felt something unlock in her that she had not known was locked, and how every day since then had been built on that foundation, not the contract but the thing behind the contract, the willingness to see her clearly and invest in what he saw. He read it at the kitchen table while she sat across from him, and he was silent for a long time after he finished it, and then he looked at her and she could see all of it in his face, the whole 5 years and everything before them and everything ahead. He said, "Ruby," she said, "I know." He came around the table and she stood, and they held each other in the kitchen, with the lamp making its warm yellow light on the walls, and the stars outside the window, and the children sleeping in their rooms, and the town of Dustcreek going about its Saturday evening around them. And it was everything, she thought. It was the complete and whole answer to the question she had been living for 29 years. By the spring of 1886, Dustcreek had grown to the point that it was no longer accurately described as a small cattle town. The railroad had come within 12 miles, and there were regular freight services running from the railhead, and the population had doubled from what it was in 1878, and there were 3 hotels now and 2 doctors, and a proper schoolhouse with 2 teachers, and a new courthouse in the new county organization that had placed Dustcreek as a county seat, which was a distinction that added both status and considerable bureaucratic activity to the town's character. Through all of this growth, certain things remained constant. The laundry on the south end of the original property, now expanded into its own proper building, was Ruby's, and she ran it with the same combination of technical excellence and genuine human decency that she had always brought to it. The trading post at the far end of Main Street was Eli's, though Main Street was considerably longer now, and the far end was less far, and it remained what it had always been, the store where you could find what you needed and where the prices were honest, and the man at the desk would tell you plainly if he did not have what you were looking for rather than selling you something that would do less well. They were respected in the town, not in the social performance way that some people sought respect, but in the quiet fundamental way that comes from doing what you say and saying what you mean over a sufficient number of years that the record speaks for itself. Thomas Graves, at 6 years old, was the image of his father in temperament, direct and curious and steady, and he had his mother's green eyes and her way of reading situations, which combination his teacher found both inspiring and occasionally exhausting. Clara, at 4, had still not fully deployed whatever she was accumulating behind those dark eyes, but evidence was beginning to emerge that it was going to be considerable. Ruby found, in these years of established life, that the love she had for Eli was not of the kind that required extraordinary circumstances to be visible. It was present in the ordinary, in the way they moved through their house and their days and their town, in the way he always left the lamp on for her when she was working late on accounts, in the way she always knew when he had had a difficult day before he said anything because she had learned the particular set of his shoulders that meant he was carrying something. It was present in the way they disagreed sometimes, because they did disagree. Two strong and opinionated people were always going to disagree, and in the fact that they had never once in 8 years of partnership disagreed in a way that was aimed at diminishment, always disagreed in the way of people who are trying to find the right answer rather than trying to win. She thought sometimes about the morning the roof fell in, which felt simultaneously very long ago and completely immediate, the way that the important mornings of your life do. She thought about standing in the yard in the dark with plaster in her hair looking at the stars through the hole in her ceiling and saying, well, that is that, meaning an ending. She thought about how wrong she had been, or rather how right in the wrong direction, because it had been that all right, an ending of one kind of life and the beginning of another. She thought about being 24 years old and alone and tired and determined, and she was grateful for all 3 of those qualities because they had kept her standing until he walked through the door. And she thought about what he had said to her, standing in the doorway of the laundry with his hat in his hand, when she had called his offer charity and he had told her plainly and without performance that it was not charity. It was an investment and she was worth the risk. She had thought in that moment that it was a business statement. And it was. And it was also something more, which she had understood slowly and then all at once, the way most true things arrive. It was a man telling a woman, in the clearest language he had, that he saw her. The whole of her, the difficulty and the capability and the pride and the fear and the green eyes and the strong hands and the clear head and the bruised heart. He saw all of it and he was making the bet. She had been worth it. So had he. On an evening in late spring of 1886, with the new cedar smell roof above them, and the children in the yard with the golden light of the Texas sunset on their faces, Thomas running and Clara watching with her arms crossed in a way that suggested she was formulating a considered critique of his running technique, Ruby sat on the wide covered porch with her ledger open and her coffee going cold beside her. And she looked at her family and her land and her town, and she felt the complete and solid happiness of a woman who has built her life out of honest materials. Eli came out of the house with his own coffee and looked at her face and said, "What are you thinking?" She looked up at him, this man she had signed her name next to 8 years ago on a kitchen table over a fair contract and a leap of faith, and she said, "I am thinking that you made a very good investment." He sat down in his chair beside hers and looked out at the children in the gold light and said, "The best I ever made." She put her hand on his arm and left it there, and they watched their children in the evening light, and the mockingbird in the cottonwood practiced its repertoire, and the Texas sky did its theatrical things with the colors, and the whole of Dustcreek went about its evening around them, growing and breathing, and being the place they had chosen and built and loved. Thomas ran toward the porch with some urgent report about a grasshopper of impressive size, and Clara followed at a more deliberate pace with the expression of someone preparing a counter-argument, and Eli stood to receive them, and Ruby closed her ledger and stood beside him, and the evening settled around all of them like something that had always been meant to. The roof held, the business grew, the children thrived. And Ruby Keene, who had once stood in her yard in the dark and looked at the stars through a hole in her ceiling and thought she was looking at the bottom of things, understood now that she had been looking, without knowing it, all the way through to the beginning.